Let's take a look at the impact of financial leverage on return. So financial leverage is the case where you're using borrowed funds as a source of capital. And what leverage does is it has the effect of magnifying gains and losses. When you buy a house and get a mortgage, you're using leverage. And in fact, that's why your return can be so great. You might put 20% down on, let's say, a $200,000 house, so you're putting $40,000 down, but your return is going to be based on the $40,000 you put down. You've borrowed the other $160,000. So if the house goes up in value, you can make a lot of money. So there's a formula here that they use on the CFA, in the CFA program, where the return on a portfolio equals the investment return plus this adjustment for using leverage. So that's the value of borrowed funds divided by the value of the equity portfolio. Now, of course, if you don't borrow any funds, this is zero, so your return on the portfolio is just going to be equal to the return on the investment. If you borrow money, then you're going to have this magnification effect. If the investment return is greater than the cost of borrowing, then leverage is going to enhance the portfolio return. And if the investment return is less than the cost of borrowing, then leverage will reduce the portfolio return. So that certainly makes sense. Okay, and it's going to magnify that. So let's look at a couple of examples here. So the first case, let's assume that there's no cost to borrow. Okay, it makes it simple to do the example, and then I'll show you one where we actually have a cost of borrowing. Let's consider the case where the investment return is 10% and the cost of borrowing is 0%. What happens when prices increase by 10%? What happens when prices fall by 10%? So I've got this table here. So let's assume that you have $1,000 to invest. So in the no leverage case, you don't borrow anything. Your total investment is $1,000. It increases by 10%, so that makes it $1,100. Your return is going to be the $1,100 minus the original investment of $1,000 divided by 1,000. 100 divided by 1,000 is 10%. Okay, so you get exactly the return that you get when prices rise by 10%. What if you use leverage here? Suppose, for example, you invest $1,000, but you borrow $4,000. You've now invested $5,000. The increase is now going to be 10% increase on the 5,000, so it's 5,500. So what's your return? It's the 5,500 minus the 5,000 you invested, but the return is going to be based on the original investment, not the borrowed money. So this is going to be 500 divided by 1,000, and you're going to get a 50% return. If we want to plug into the equation we had before, the return on the portfolio here is going to be 10% plus, this is going to be 0, so this is all going to drop out. You're going to get a 10% return. With the leverage, it's going to be 10% plus the 4,000 over 1,000 times 10% minus 0 borrowing cost. So 4 times 10% is 40% plus the 10%, you get the same 50% return. What happens when prices fall by 10%? Let's see again. If you're not borrowing any money, you're going to lose $100. The value of your portfolio is going to fall to $900. So you're going to be minus 100 divided by 1,000. You're going to lose 10%. If you use leverage, this 5,000 is going to fall to 4,500. Right, a 10% decrease is going to cause this to lose $500. Here you're going to be minus 500 subtracting the divided by 1,000, right? So 4,500 minus 5,000 is negative 500 divided by 1,000. You're going to lose 50%. And again, you can see this Let's forget about the no leverage case because it's not very interesting. So here's the minus 10% plus 4 here times minus 10%. So you're going to lose 50%. All right, let's move on to the case where we have some borrowing costs. Let's consider the case where the investment return is 10% and the cost of borrowing is 5%. What happens when prices increase by 10%? What happens when prices fall by 10%? So here, again, in the no leverage case, nothing happens, right? It's going to be the same, goes up by 10%, and so you're going to earn 10%. With leverage, you have that $5,000 to invest. The total value of your portfolio is $5,500 minus the $200 that you pay in interest. That's 5% of the $4,000. So you have $5,300. $5,300 minus $5,000, 300 over 1,000. 30%. So you can see that when there's a cost of borrowing, it magnifies your gain, but not as much, obviously, as when there's zero cost of borrowing. Okay, when there was zero cost of borrowing, your return went up 50%. And then finally, what happens when prices fall by 10% and the cost of borrowing is 5%? Again, here, your portfolio is going to be $5,000 originally. It falls to $4,500 minus the $200 that you pay in interest. So $4,300 minus the $5,000 gives us $700 over 1,000. You're going to lose 70%, and you can see that down here. Minus 10%. 4 times, remember it's minus 10 minus 5, so that's minus 15%. So 4 times 15% is minus 60% plus the minus 10%. So you lose 70%. So when there's a cost of borrowing, it magnifies the loss even more because you're paying for it, and it causes the gain to be not as great as when there are zero borrowing costs. So I hope you found this useful, and thanks for watching.